In the autumn of 1914, millions of young men from Europe, Russia, America, Africa, India and even Australia, armed with state-of-the-art weapons, by boats, by rail, in lorries, ran into each other. That is how World War I began. That is how began the 20th century. Years later, people ask themselves what the actual reason for this nightmare was. Some insisted that the reason was the assassination in Sarajevo of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serb student Gavrilo Princip. Others still blame everything on the cruel personality of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. Unfortunately, neither politicians, nor historians, nor millions of killed and wounded, nor even authors like Erich Maria Remarque, Thomas Mann, Henri Barbusse, Ernest Hemingway, Franz Kafka or Jaroslav Hašek, who dedicated great books to this war, knew the ultimate answer. Most of them believed that it would be the last war in world history. 2 decades later, it turned out that they were wrong. Wars, revolutions and genocides begin in human minds and souls just as subterranean or stellar cataclysms are ripening from centuries obeying terrestrial and cosmic laws. The new century upset the ordinary image of the world by Einstein's theory of relativity, nuclear experiments by the Curie spouses, and Freud's theory of subconscious. Artists like Charlie Chaplin and Pablo Picasso reflected the distorted and chaotic world in odd and prophetic characters. At the same time, the disillusioned humanity faced unprecedented progress of science and technology. The brightest example of that was the invention by German engineers Daimler and Diesel of the internal combustion engine, which gave an unprecedented impetus to the development of motor vehicles, warships and aircraft, drastically changing the global economy and politics in a matter of years. The new engines required a new fuel. Coal was replaced by petroleum. The oil resources were situated in those days in a backyard of the Russian Empire, Baku, and in Arabian deserts owned by the Ottoman Empire. The latter was most interested in the new European superpower, Germany. And naturally, the global superpower, the British Empire, disliked all this thoroughly. This was the fertile soil on which the seeds of the World War fell. However, to reach the oil fields and to deliver troops there, bypassing the British Navy, railway was needed from Berlin to Baghdad. The existing Oriental Express line ran through Austria, Serbia and Bulgaria and stopped in Constantinople. According to the German strategists, to build the Baghdad railway, about 100,000 workers were needed, preferably Armenians, the only farming and hard-working nation in the midst of the surrounding nomadic tribes. For this purpose, the enterprising Germans planned to build concentration camps along the future railway for the laborers and their families. The clock of the Armenian genocide was set off. The Ottoman government accepted the designs of its strategic ally, but only partially. The matter was that Great Britain, concerned about the German-Turkish oil transportation and military cooperation, rejected its traditional pro-Turkish policy and on the pretext of Christian philanthropy started to help Serbia, Bulgaria and Greece to liberate from the Turkish yoke. Moreover, the oil imported by Berlin-Baghdad line was supposed to run through these countries. In the early 20th century, having lost its European colonies, the disintegrating Turkey focused its fury on the last Christian minority, the Armenians. The Ottoman and later the Young Turk governments, having availed themselves of the precise German designs for the displacement of Armenians, were not going to carry out the German dreams about rail transportation of oil to Berlin. Particularly when the British intelligence got involved in the organization of anti-Turkish insurgents amongst Arabic tribes and creation of future pro-British governance structures in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Palestine. Someone must have been held liable for that. On November 14, 1914, the religious leader of Turkey, Sheikh-ul-Islam, announced a holy war or jihad on the Christians. Naturally, the most convenient, defenseless and obvious target were the Armenians. Thus, the planned displacement was raised to planned genocide. On April 25, 1915, the Anglo-Australian Navy invaded the Dardanelles and attacked the Turkish and German troops. The day before, on April 24, Armenian massacres had started in Istanbul. In the meantime, millions of unaware young soldiers with jolly songs rushed towards the huge slaughterhouse. Amongst them was a 37-year-old Armin Teofil Wagner. He was assigned to the concentration camps at Berlin-Baghdad railway, which the Germans wanted to turn into temporary dwellings for the Armenian laborers, but the Turkish government turned them into the largest site of state-sponsored genocide. There was another fatal feature which made Armin Wagner different from the others. In his haversack, with his clothes and medication, he had a photo camera. This made him a historical eyewitness, whose mission was to save for the future generations the things that shall not be forgotten and never again repeated. To his parents, Constantinople, November 2, 1915. Written under the hot autumn sun. When you receive these lines, I shall already be far from this country. I'm going to Baghdad. I have been assigned to the military mission. They have taken away my rank and I'm now no more than an ordinary soldier with so little pay that I can't imagine how I shall ever survive. I will sleep with the Turkish soldiers and eat leftovers like a rat. Nevertheless, I have had some luck. I have joined the corps of Field Marshal von der Goltz as nurse. I had to struggle to obtain this post. And now I hold the helm of my life in my own hands. I shall see Baghdad, the Tigris, Mosul and Babylon. I am fully aware of the choice I have made. I am no longer a voluntary nurse, I have become a soldier, like the others. My soul is as free as a bird. Whatever should happen, I have taken this step. I have put my life at stake for the sake of my soul, and I am happy. In a week's time we shall leave, with open and excited eyes. Your son follows, always willing to forgive, full of love for this world, and always ready to accept life's challenges. 1 week later, to Karl Hauptmann, from Arnautköy, November 10, 1915. This very hour as I am writing these lines, beyond the colorful hills surrounding the Bosphorus, at which I oftentimes cast a horrified glance, there is a desolate and devastated land. I know that behind this silent curtain, a bloody and terrible play is being enacted where corpses are the actors. On this blood-stained stage, running from the foothills of the Caucasus to the banks of the river Tigris, the new exodus of the Armenian people towards the desert is taking place. We were told that the Armenian soldiers of the Turkish army betrayed a country that has enslaved them. But the Turks are not satisfied by the elimination of traitors and spies. The Turks need no court trial, they see no difference. It is the blood that is prosecuted, the whole nation. They have availed themselves of this fatal opportunity when the European nations are busy with their own problems, when their hands are also stained with the blood of the war. Where is the newly hatched courage of the young Turkey, which promised to prevent the atrocities unleashed by Abdul Hamid? I'm not even trying to understand the logic of these actions. It will remain ununderstandable to us forever. I realize that we deal with a situation perpetrated by this government unexpectedly and absurdly. And as usual, the crimes are disguised in the name of Islam, used for degrading, blasphemous purposes. A world of terror and death is being created, which out of fear of death and madness uses ancient and time-tested measures, depopulation and massacres. They were trying to study our laws and justice, our armed forces, our police structure, science and crafts, our governance system only for one purpose: to find new and more horrible methods of killing. With self-asserting spitefulness, dreaming of the Islamic Reich, an empire of violence, they are blindly murdering their Armenian citizens and Syrian Christians, destroying their enterprises and vineyards, kill Arabs and displace Greeks. In their hands, a doctor's lancet turns into a dangerous and deadly knife. The sacred mirror of our souls turns into poison on their lips. To Margaret von Bonin, from the canteen barracks at Ras El Ain, 26 November 1915. I've just returned, this very moment, from a round of inspection of the camps. Hunger, death, disease and desperation on all sides. You could smell the odor of faces and decay. From a tent came the laments of a dying woman. A mother, identifying the dark violet badges on my uniform as those of the sanitary corps, came towards me with outstretched hands. Taking me for a doctor, she clung on to me with all her might. I, who had neither medicines nor bandages, for it was forbidden to help them. But all this is nothing compared to the frightful sight of the swarms of orphans which increase daily. At the sides of the camp, a row of holes in the ground covered with rags had been prepared for them. Girls and boys of all ages were sitting in these holes, heads together, abandoned and reduced to animals, starved, without food or bread, deprived of the most basic human aid, packed tightly one against the other and trembling from the night cold. Some could not stop crying. Their yellow hair fell and cut down over their foreheads. Their faces were sticky with tears and filth. Their youthful eyes, inscrutable, hollowed out from pain, and although they looked silently in front of them, they seemed to convey on their faces the most bitter reproach of the world. It was as if destiny had gathered together at the edge of the desert all the horrors of this world. I was struck with terror to the point that I dashed out from the camp with my heart beating wildly. All the mountain valleys, all the river banks are filled with these camps. This flood of outcasts, hundreds of thousands of refugees, drags itself along through the Taurus passes. Where are they going? Where? This is a way of no return. I took many photographs on my last days there. I'd been told that Jamal Pasha, the Syrian butcher, has forbidden taking photographs in these refugee camps, pain of death. So I have hidden those terrible images of accusation rolled up under my belt. I am aware that in doing so I am committing an act of high treason, yet fully aware that doing something, no matter how small, for this poor folk has given me greater satisfaction than anything else I have ever done in my life. One year later, Abu Herrera, 11th October 1916. The last body. As we entered the abandoned inn, full of filth and foul smells, we saw him lying face upwards in the open doorway. It was the body of an Armenian boy, with hair blown like straw, the body skin and bones, hands and feet like cudgels. Only his left arm was still clothed in rags. When I went down to the river, I found many tombs and innumerable places where fires had been lit. Is this the final destination of a ruthless and frightful chase? February of 1919. An open letter to the President of the United States of America, Woodrow Wilson. Mr. President, in your message to Congress of January 8, 1918, you made a demand for the liberation of all non-Turkish peoples in the Ottoman Empire. One of these peoples is the Armenian nation. It is on behalf of the Armenian nation that I am addressing you. As one of the few who have been eyewitnesses of the dreadful destruction of the Armenian people from the beginning in the flourishing towns and fruitful fields of Anatolia to the wiping out of their miserable remains on the banks of the Euphrates and the desolate, stony Mesopotamian desert, I dare claim the right of bringing to your attention this picture of misery and terror which passed before my eyes for nearly 2 years and which will never be obliterated from my mind. I appeal to you at the moment when the governments allied to you are carrying on peace negotiations in Paris, which will determine the fate of the world for decades. When the Turkish government, in the spring of 1915, set about the execution of its monstrous project of exterminating 2 million Armenians, all the nations of Europe were unhappily bathed in blood owing to the fatal blindness of their mutual misunderstanding, and there was no one to hinder the lurid tyrants of Turkey from carrying on to the bitter end those revolting atrocities which can only be likened to the acts of a criminal lunatic. And so they drove a whole people, men, women, elders, children, expectant mothers and nursing babies, into the Arabian desert with no other object than to let them starve to death. From their homes, where they had lived for more than 2,000 years, from all parts of the empire, from the stony passes of the mountain region to the shores of the sea and the palmy oases of the south, the Armenians were driven into the desolate waste. The men were struck down in batches, bound together with chains and ropes, and thrown into the river or rolled down the mountain with their limbs bound. The women and children were put on sale in the public market, the old men and boys driven with deadly sticks to forced labor. The captors drove the people after depriving them of their leaders and spokesmen out of the towns at all hours of the day and night, half naked, straight out of their beds, plundered their houses, burned the villages, destroyed the churches or turned them into mosques, carried off the cattle, seized all animals and vehicles, snatched the bread out of their hands, wrenched their children from their arms, tore the gold from their hair and their mouths. Officials, military officers, soldiers and shepherds vied with one another in their wild orgy of blood, dragging out of the schools delicate orphan girls to serve their bestial lust, beat with cudgels dying women or women close to childbirth who could scarcely drag themselves along, until the women fell down on the road and died, changing the dust beneath them into blood-stained mire. Travelers passing along the road turned away their eyes in horror from this moving multitude, driven on with devilish cruelty, only to find their inns newborn babies buried in the dung heaps of the courtyards, and the roads covered with severed hands of boys who had raised them in supplication to the torturers. Parties which on their departure from the homeland of High Armenia consisted of thousands, numbered on their arrival in the outskirts of Aleppo only a few hundred, while the fields were strewed with swollen, blackened corpses, infecting the air with their odors, lying about desecrated, naked, having been robbed of their clothes, or driven bound back to the Euphrates to provide food for the fishes. Sometimes gendarmes in derision threw into the emaciated hands of the starving people a little meal which they greedily licked off, merely with the result of prolonging their death agony. Children wept themselves to death, men dashed themselves against the rocks, mothers threw their babies into the brooks, women with child flung themselves singing into the Euphrates. They died all the deaths on the earth, the deaths of all times. Mr. President, the voice of conscience and humanity will never be silenced in me, and therefore I address these words to you. This document is a request. In it, the tongues of thousands dead speak. Mr. President, the wrong suffered by these people cannot be measured. I have read everything that has been written about the war. I have carefully made myself acquainted with the horrors in every country on this earth, the fearful slaughters in every battle, the ships sunk by torpedoes, the bombs thrown down on the towns by aircraft, the heart-rending slaughters in Belgium, the misery of the French refugees, the sufferings of the German deportees, the fearful sickness and epidemics in Romania. But here is wrong to be right, such as none of these nations has suffered. Perhaps only the barbarians of ancient times may possibly have endured a similar fate. But here we have a highly civilized nation with a great and glorious past, which has made unforgettable contributions to art, literature and science. A nation which has produced many remarkable and intellectual men, profoundly religious with eminent priests, a Christian people whose members are dispersed over the whole earth, many of whom have lived for many years in your country, Mr. President. Men acquainted with all the languages of the world, men whose wives and daughters have been accustomed to sit in comfortable chairs at a table covered with a clean white cloth, not to crouch in a whole duck in a desert sand. Wise merchants, distinguished doctors, scholars, artists, able and happy peasants who made the land fruitful, and whose only fault was that they were defenseless and spoke a different language from that of their persecutors and were born into a different faith. Everyone who knows the events of this war in Anatolia, who has followed the fortunes of this nation with open eyes, knows that all those accusations which were brought against the Armenian race are nothing but loathsome slanders fabricated by their unscrupulous tyrants, in order to shield themselves from the consequences of their own mad and brutal acts, and to hide their own incapacity for reconciliation with the spirit of sincerity and humanity. But even if all these accusations were based on the truth, they would never justify these cruel deeds committed against hundreds of thousands of innocent people. I am making no accusation against Islam. The spirit of every great religion is noble. I do not accuse the simple people of this country, but I do not think that the members of the ruling class will ever, in a course of history, be capable of making their country happy, for they have destroyed our belief in their capacity for civilization. Turkey has forfeited for all time the right to govern itself. Mr. President, in the Berlin Treaty of 1878, all the 6 European great powers gave the most solemn guarantees that they would guard the tranquility and security of the Armenian people. But has this promise ever been kept? Even Abdul Hamid's massacres failed to refresh their memory, and in blind greed they pursued selfish aims, not one putting itself forward as the champion of an oppressed people. In the armistice between Turkey and your allies, which the Armenians all over the world awaited with anxiety, the Armenian question is scarcely mentioned. Shall this unworthy game be repeated a second time? And must the Armenians be once more disillusioned? The future of this small nation must not be relegated to obscurity behind the selfish scams and plans of the great states. Mr. President, save the honor of Europe. It would be a terrible mistake if the Armenian districts of Russia were not joined with the Armenian provinces of Anatolia and Cilicia to form one common country entirely liberated from Turkish rule, with an outlet of its own to the sea. Only in this way could a new equilibrium be achieved, necessary not only for the return of the numerous refugees who fled over the Russian border, but also to bring back life to deserted towns and villages. It is not enough, Mr. President, that you should know the suffering of these people. It's not enough that you should give them a state in which houses are destroyed, fields laid waste, citizens murdered. The exhaustion of this country is such that by its own strength it cannot rise again. Its trade is ruined, its handicrafts and industries have collapsed. The assets of its annihilated population can never be restored. Many thousands of Armenians were converted to Islam by force. Thousands of children and girls kidnapped, and thousands of women carried away and made slaves in Turkish harems. All this must be assured of their return to freedom. All victims of persecution who are returning to their homes after spending 2 years and more in the desert must be indemnified for wealth and goods that they have lost. All orphans must be cared for. What these people need is love, of which they have so long been deprived. This is for all of us a confession of guilt. Mr. President, you will not fail to perceive that even in these words a mighty voice speaks, the only voice that has the right to be heard at all times, the voice of humanity. Armin Teofil Wagner. As a result of the two world slaughters, Germany not only didn't attain any of its geopolitical goals, but after heavy defeats was divided instead and underwent the humiliating political and economic penalties, being forced to pay the reimbursement and compensations for decades. Turkey, which still bears the infamous name of the Sixth State, has lost a lot of the conquered territories in Europe, Africa and Asia, maintaining only the ethnically cleansed Armenian homeland where the insurgent Kurds now fight for their independence. The British Empire has likewise collapsed, losing almost all of its colonies from Canada to South Africa and from Egypt to India. Now Britain is limited to the status of a second-rank European country. France was also forced to give up control over its colonies in Northern Africa and Southeast Asia after the Second World War, failing to implement its ambitious political agenda. Russia experienced two major destructions in the beginning and in the end of the 20th century, first as an empire, then as a Soviet Union. The oil resources discovered in the north of the country after the World War II still remain as a primary source of national revenue. The United States gained the status of the world's greatest power and got involved in the series of endless conflicts to secure the control over the Middle East oil resources. Currently, the US seems to be following the same way the Ottoman, Russian and British empires had passed already. Armenia regained its independence on the actual 1/10 of its historical territories, where approximately 3 million Armenians live now, just as many as it was in Russian and Ottoman empires 100 years ago, before the genocide. 3 times more Armenians live abroad. On March 15, 1921, the former interior minister of Ottoman Turkey, Talat Pasha, was assassinated in Berlin by Soghomon Teylerian. The trial drew worldwide attention. The defense submitted documents establishing Talat as a prime executor of the Armenian massacres. The jury acquitted Teylerian. This unprecedented trial captured the attention of a young lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who realized that a civilization still doesn't have a law and punishment on the murder of the whole nation. Thus, Lemkin drafted the international law to prevent mass slaughter of the kind the Armenians faced in Ottoman Turkey since 1915. The word that Lemkin invented to describe this crime was genocide. In 1948, the United Nations declared the genocide a crime against humanity. Armin Wegner was exiled from Turkey in 1916, being accused of illegal photo shootings of the Armenian massacres. In 1933, as a witness of the Armenian genocide, he wrote a letter to Germany's newly elected Chancellor Adolf Hitler, calling upon him to stop the repressions against the Jews. Hitler sent Wegner to a concentration camp, but he indirectly answered him in his 1939 infamous remark, "Who speaks now about the extermination of the Armenians?" In 1996, Armin Wegner's ashes laid to rest at the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan.